Once upon a time in those happy days, there lived a little boy as the memory stays. He loved his grandpa more than words could tell, for Saba's voice held kindness and truth as well. He taught him Torah, how to pray right, saw his questions in the softest light. Though miles were long and roads were wide, their voices always found a bridge inside. But life is written by the Almighty's hand, and every soul has its measured span. One morning came when Grandpa's soul departed Bekavad, complete and whole. The boy sat still, the world felt thin, yet something whispered deep within. Love does not stop, love does not fall. Love travels through time in any wall. And oh, deep love and care still flow from worlds above to the heart below. Across the distance, across the years, through quiet mornings, through hidden tears, he feels his grandpa near his side, a guiding flame that will not hide. Blessed be the Almighty's name, who guards the bond that stays the same. Years have passed and the boy stood tall, yet carried the same love through it all. On the day that marked his grandpa's rest, he gathered strength from inside his chest. He traveled far on steady feet to the place where earth and memory meet. At the grave he stood in true devotion and whispered Kaddish with steady emotion. Yit gadol v'yit Kaddish Shemei Rabbah Bal Madivra Hirute V'yem Limalhute Pei Hom. Others arrived, drawn by the light of the young man's heart shining bright. They prayed together beneath the sky and felt the years gently drifting by. Grandpa's goodness filled the air, a legacy of simple, genuine care. The boy knew then nothing is lost. There is a bridge that love can cross. And still the love flows on like dawn that rises after night is gone. Across the distance, across every year, through every joy and every fear, he hears his Saba's voice inside as Grandpa's soul ascends in pride. Blessed be the Almighty, fair and wise, judge of truth, whose light always shines.